Hello, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to another set of topics for the final term. No, first topic is the final term, and it's entitled the CRDR Image Evaluation. So we'll be discussing here again a review of the exposure indicator range. How will you identify the median pixel value or the median value, and also the range? No, on saan yung pagkuha sa range sa inyong exposures. And then I'll be discussing also the contrast, recorded detail, some of the artifacts found on digital and computed radiography, and hold on, I think that's all, and also contrast too. Okay, so to start, let's go with exposure indicator range first. Okay, yeah. We all know from the previous topics that the median value in the image depicted through a histogram is also the exposure indicator from a specific manufacturer. So as you can see, pangitaon ninyo ang median value ang pinakatunga jud, this is kani. Okay, this is your exposure indicator. Okay? For each manufacturer, a target median pixel value, which represents the ideal amount of extra exposure at the detectors, is set at the center point of the exposure indicator scale. Okay? So di ba previously gimension naman po na kung saan nasa middle sa histogram mo siyang exposure indicator and is the ideal exposure for that specific machine na i-provide sa specific manufacturer. So that means if ang provider ninyo is si Fuji, for example, lahi ang ilang exposure indicator and exposure indicator scale from Philips, from Alara CR and the other manufacturers. Okay? So lahi-lahi na sila. Same sa kung giingon po last time. This then becomes the target exposure indicator. Okay, ang ideal, this middle area here is a target exposure indicator. And a range of acceptable exposure indicator values is framed around the center point for guidance to radiographers as to whether the radiographic technique fell within an acceptable range of exposures. Okay, so since lisod man kayo acquire ang thin line sa inyong median na exposure indicator, your manufacturer will set a scale, of course, from S1 to S2, including na sa exposure indicator, para ang aim ninyo is to provide an exposure to the patient within the acceptable range. Okay, so the target exposure indicator and the range of acceptable exposure indicators are all based generally upon the median pixel value in the image, determined by each manufacturer's particular method. So provided na siya na ang ideal na exposure is nasa middle sa histogram, mao ni ang iyahang value, and the exposure indicator scale is the exposure indicator scale surrounds the median exposure value. Nagadepende na siya sa inyong exposure indicator, ideal exposure indicator, target exposure indicator. Okay? So the primary function of exposure indicators are to help the radiographer avoid overexposure to the patient. Of course, as the name states, exposure indicator, it indicates how huge the amount or how small the amount of X-rays was given to the patient. A lower limit to exposure is imposed by the appearance of image mottle. So to avoid either extremes, an overexposure and appearance of image mottle, it is useful to define a target range for the exposure indicator. Since again, as I have said a while ago, this would targeton ang middle range lang. So, or the median value lang. Okay? So dapat naatay range ang mga radiographer na murag basehan na, okay, pagpasok sa ani na range, okay, good to go na ko, okay ang exposure sa pasyente. Because again, lisod kay achieve tong target na middle exposure value. Kasi murag isa lang siya ka-value na imong targeton. Okay? So, accuracy and preciseness is difficult to achieve with this one. Okay? To avoid either extremes, again, overexposure and appearance of image mottle due to lesser provisions of X-rays, it is useful to define a target range for the exposure indicator within which the radiographers should strive to keep all exposures. So dapat, pag mag-expose ang radiographers, the exposure indicators na nasa scale mo ito ilahang i-pursue na ma-achieve nila na ito dito lang din para makaprovide sila og gwapo na image and also keeping the principle of ALARA. Yan. Acceptable parameters for exposure. The common approach to determining ranges of acceptable exposure is to allow from 1/2 to 2 times the ideal exposure, delivering an average exposure to the receptor plate of 0.5 to 2 millirentgen. For operation at the 200 speed class, this formula yields the following acceptable ranges of exposure indicators. So, na-discuss na po na ko ni previously sa inyong CRDR image acquisition, di ba? Na for each lahi ang exposure indicators for each manufacturer. So for example, si Fuji, okay, kani siya is 200 ang speed class ani ha. For example, si Fuji for 200 speed class, low exposure which is kani siya to high exposure. So exposure indicator ani is sa man. Okay? It's the middle value. So since di ba ang ideal exposure indicator nato is the median pixel value man, which is the middle of these range. This range, no? This range of exposure indicator. So that means your middle value or your median value here is 200. Okay? So half sa exposure sa 200 is 100, which will start sa inyong range, exposure indicator range, and of course, 400 times 2. Okay, di ba kay 1/2 to 2 times the ideal exposure man. So your exposure indicator range now is from 100 to 400 if your speed class is 200 po. Okay? So for Kodak, 1,700 to 2,300, that means di ba na silang marag interval na 300. So ang median pixel value ani is unsa man 2,000. Okay? So 2,000 tapos ang minus 300 because of the interval. Pag naa sila interval na 300, limawasan nimo sa median pixel value which is 2,000, which results to 1,700. Okay, ang start sa iyang range. And then overexposed na siya pag more than 2,300. Okay? So sa Kodak, ang interval niya is 300. Pag nabawasan ng 300, that means underexposed na siya. Pag dungagan ng 300, that means it's overexposed. For AGFA, it's the same. Naput sila interval. So for this range, 2.2 to 2.8, unsa man ang ilang median value ani. So 2.2, 2.2. Yes, 2.4. Okay? So 2.4. So si 2.4, pag duwagan mo siya og times 2, so 2.4, not necessarily times 2, the end value ba sa kaning na value. Okay? So i-times 2 nimo si 4, 8. Bawasan nimo si 4 og half, 2. Okay? So ang median pixel value sa alpha is 2.4. Again, i-half nimo ang kaning diri na value, decimal value, okay? By half sa 4 is 2 and double sa 4 is 8. Okay? So muna sila ang median pixel value for AGFA. And then sa Philips Manggod, kani siya. Wala na ako ni siya na-discuss last time. But ang sa median value sa Philips is, ano siya? Yan eh. Since the range is from 55 to 22, that means that the median pixel value is unsa man? Okay? It is 110. Okay? So pag times 2, it's 2 times the ideal exposure since low exposure to high exposure man siya. So 220 is high exposure, overexposed na siya na value. 55 is underexposed, appearance of quantum motile na siya. Note that allowing a reduction of 50% or 1/2 of the target value to delineate the lower margin of the acceptable range may be too great an increment because it is possible for unacceptable levels of motile to be present in some images with 60% of target exposure. So, pag ang yung exposure indicator matagak na siya sa mga lower margin sa inyong scale, which is 100, 17, 2.2, and 55, there is a great possibility na magka-quantum motile na siya. It's because, as I have said, pag 60% magani na ni quantum motile, unsa na lang ang mga half, such as kanina as the lower margin sa inyong exposure scale. So that means you have to, as much as possible, avoid the lower margin na mga values for exposure indicators because it will yield quantum motile. Kani siya 50% naman siya. Tapos ang i-mention is 60% sa target exposure will produce a quantum motile. So that means ang lower margin ninyo, which is kani, will already produce a quantum motile of which we need to avoid. Okay, so dapat mas taas pa ani ang exposure indicator sa lower margin. Next, for distal extremities na 100 speed ang class, 100 ang speed class, From low exposure to high exposure, si Fuji is 75 to 200. Ang median pixel value niya ani for 100 speed class is 100. Okay, for Fuji. So the question is, nganong 75 siya, sir, na dapat, di ba dapat 50 man siya? The answer is 75 man good for Fuji manufacturer is considered as underexposed na siya. Okay? So mag-start sa 75, although dapat 50 siya, but considered as underexposed na man good ang 75. So that means 75 na magsugod, median pixel value is 100, overexposure is 200. Okay? For Kodak na 100 speed class, 200 to 400. Kung sa man ang iyahang median pixel value, it's 2,250, if I'm not mistaken, or 2,300. We'll check natin. Okay, for Kodak, it is 2,300 pala. Okay, so bawasan mo ang 300 by 100 since the speed class is 100. So the result of for the lower margin of the scale is 2,200. And for the higher margin or the upper margin of the scale, it's 2,400. For AGFA, it's 2.1 to 2.2 set at 100 speed class. So ang iyang median value is 2.0. So bawasan mo ang 2.0 by 1 ay by half. It's, bawasan mo ang median pixel value by 1 is, 2.1, ang lower margin. Doon nga ganin mo times 2, it's 2.2 at 100 speed class. Okay? So yung answer siya. Then for Philips, it's 40 to 70. So ang median pixel value niya is, is 55. Okay, so the median pixel value for Philips na ang range niya is 40 to 70 is 55. Okay, so there is an increment of 15. So 55 plus 15 is 70. 55 minus 15 is 40. So muna siya ang scale. Radiography of the distal extremities presents a special problem for CR systems. Due to the part thickness, the exposures required are inherently low and mottle becomes apparent in the digital images. So what are we going to do? Okay, in order to provide sufficient signal to the receptor plate, higher KVPs than traditionally used for distal extremities are recommended. Okay, also the acceptable range for the exposure indicators must be adjusted upward, and the common approach is to base these upon operation at the 100 speed class. Since distal extremities are different from kanang mga chest, mga abdomen, and it involves higher KVP, no, 100 speed class ang ato ang ginagamit na for the exposure indicator niya. Since bony man ang inyong upper and lower extremities, no? So, yes, higher KVP is needed. Okay, so mag-base sa 100 speed class rather than the 200 speed class. Also, it is important to note that these values apply to DR since all procedures are done with the grid in place, including all extremities. So for these acceptable parameters for exposures at distal extremities is not only applicable for CR and DR, CR not only applicable for CR but also to DR. Okay, the grid requires higher techniques to be used, and generally sufficient signal reaches the receptor to obviate the need to specify a different range of exposure parameters. So, naay marag exception for distal extremities since again they are bony, they require an increase in KVP. Therefore, ang atong ginagamit na speed class is 100 na speed class rather than 200 for both CR and DR. Okay? In order for the, in order for sufficient signal to be produced, kinahanglan natataas ang KVP because kung dili siya taas, mottle becomes apparent in the digital images. Additionally, the higher the speed mango, diba? So you can remember sa film screen, diba? The higher the speed, the more sensitive they are to radiation. So that means lesser radiographic technique can be used, therefore lesser patient dose, but there is a sacrifice in the image quality. So same applies to the CRDR na parameters. Okay, so the more na ibaba ni mo ang speed class, the more it becomes less sensitive to radiation, more technique, and diba pag more technique, higher is the patient dose, but your quality of the image is much better than those of the higher speed class. Okay, so muna siya gibabaan ang speed sa extremities because again, lower speed, higher ang inyong technique na gamiton, that means higher KVP, muna to siya. And then, your mottle will be less apparent because pag increase mo ang radiographic technique, it will increase your image quality. Okay? Hopefully na gets ninyo ang relationship. Actually, it's just a review na lang man po. Okay? So mo to siya ang rationale behind. So for the recommended exposure indicator control limits for clinical images, so mo ni siya ang mga kanang ginabuhat na to na range. Okay? So of course, if it is more than the 1.0 or katong sobra na siya sa upper margin sa inyong scale, it will produce an excessive patient exposure. Okay? So sa man inyong buhaton ana, no repeat unless image burnout occurs from saturation or management follow-up. So ang buhaton ang image manggod ani is sunog na gid na siya. Since there is an overexposure to the patient, of course ma-compromise pud ang quality sa inyong image. For example, ayan, okay? So, di ba saturated na kayo siya, wala makita na but what I mean by saturated is medyo sunog siya. The colors are too much of a short scale na. Okay? So, mo na siya ang murag kaapan pag overexposed ng pasyente. Although gwapang image niyo sa ubang areas, there are areas na oversaturated na siya. Okay? So pareha ani, the lung markings are not visible anymore. So kung normal na siya na picture such as this one, di ba? Daghan na kay colors. Too much of a short scale siya na contrast. Okay? So dili ani mo ma-differentiate ang bone, ang lung markings, and the other areas. Okay? So mo to siya for kung over the upper margin. Okay? The deviation is increased or too much increase. Pag between 0.5 to 1.0, which is still above the within the exposure range and upper margin sa exposure range and with a deviation of plus 0.5, no, a half to 1.0, half or twice, no, overexposure gyapon siya, i-repeat lang siya if saturated or burnout ang inyong image. Okay? So ang target range na to is negative 0.5 to positive 0.5, no, sa exposure deviation. So di ba, for example, para 3,000. Okay? For so may ba po na example Agfa na lang. Fuji. Okay, so di ba ang normal niya na range for exposure sa 200 na speed class is 100 to 400. Okay, katoto example ha, 100 to 400. So, if nag-deviate siya by half to 1.0, okay? So, kani siya sa half pa lang, additional half pa lang, or nag-double mo og ang value sa yung exposure indicator, so overexposed na siya. Okay? What you're going to do is to repeat lang siya if saturated na ang inyong image. Our target range is negative 0.5 to positive 0.5. In this case, sa Fuji, we have 100 to 400, which is ang median value niya is 200 man, di ba? So, ang ano niya is, yes, kato ang range niya. So, 100 to 400 ni siya. Okay, this one, that is our target range. Okay, 100 to 400. So, wala tayong recommended action because your image is sakto man siya. Okay, it's optimal. Okay, so pag below 100 na siya, which sa atong case, which is Fuji, below 100 na siya, underexposed na siya. Pag below, sobra pagid sa below sa 100, which is 0, if I'm not mistaken, kaya negative 0.5 is below 100 naman. Okay, so pag below 50 pag yun, which is half sa 100, excessive na yung underexposure. Okay, so check ninyo kung i-repeat for underexposed na image, which is sa 100 na margin, since quantum model is apparent, you have to consult the radiologist for repeat. Kung okay, kung mabasa ba niya or dili. Kung dili niya mabasa, you have to repeat. Kani excessive underexposure, excessive model is certain naman, so you'll have to really repeat this procedure. Okay? So sige, recap. Kaya medyo dili kayo klaro akong pagka-explain. So, let's take for example again si Fuji na iyahang range is 100 to 400. Okay? So if that happens, 100 to 400, that is the target range. Okay? Kaya di ba ang 100 man is half the exposure. Okay, and 400 is double the exposure. So ang median exposure, median control, median pixel value man nato is 200. So 200, half of 200 is 100, which is direct. And then times 2, so 100, the 200 is 400. So muna siya tong target range. So 200 to 400. So ang ato overexposed na range is 400 to 600. Okay? 600. Ano ba? Yes. Okay, 400 to 600 overexposed na siya na range. Okay? Kung dire 600 and above na exposure indicator, excessive na siya na patient exposure. Okay? So 6, wait lang. Sulatan na to. Okay, so this one is 600. This one is 600. This one is 400 to 600. This one is 100 to 400. And kanisha dire is 50 to 100. And kanisha is less than, less than 50. Okay? So for ang example lang nato aniha is Fuji. Dili na siya true to all. Okay? So ikaw na bahala mag compute ana kung sabay value. Okay? But yes, for the Fuji mo ni siya ang murag ihang ranges for exposure deviation. So pag 600 gani excessive na kay na siya na patient exposure ang gawa sa inyong indicator. Okay? Pag 400 to 600, that's overexposure. Ang target range na to is 100 to 400 man, so sakto lang. And then your underexposed na the value is 50 to 100. So 100 man ang ato ang lower margin. So So less than 100. Okay. So less than 100 is underexposed. Less than 50 pag yun, which is half, so 100, excessive underexposure na siya. Okay? Yun. So, if you have questions regarding this one, I know it's a little bit confusing. You can message me man sa Messenger. I can enlighten you or mag-review na lang yun ta para naatanan. Okay? So, to continue. Okay, let's go to noise. Medyo easy na lang yung mga preceding na slides. Okay? So next one is electronic or computer noise. All electronic imaging system components such as television cameras, all electronic imaging system components such as television cameras, image intensifier, and CRT monitors have associated with them the aberrant movement of electrons resulting in an artifact called electronic noise. So di ba, you can remember katong mga cathode ray tubes na mga TV sa una katong dakog likod, di ba, you have to hapak-hapakon pa nimo in order para mawala ni siyang electronic noise. So it is inherent, some of it are inherent na gid sa mga monitors. Okay? Like quantum model, electronic noise is also a random effect that produces regions of increased image brightness that appear on image displays such as flashes of light or snow. The snow-like patterns seen on a television monitor tuned to a weak station or the background static in a sound system are two examples of electronic noise. Okay? So muna siya, electronic noise, computer noise, kanang makita niyo sa monitor na magkarat-karat sa mga TV. Okay? So most likely this noise is dynamic. So magliyok-liyok siya ba? Ano? For quantum model, ang difference lang nila is si quantum model is sa image siya mismo. Dili siya maglihok-lihok such pareha sa inyong electronic noise. The X-ray beam is a shower of X-rays which have a random distribution, just like the drops in a rain shower. So dili man gyud ang X-rays ninyo, dili man siya you call that, pag na siya sure gid ko na dire ko padulong. Okay? It's a random distribution sa padulong sa image receptor. Okay? So dili siya determined na okay kani siya na X-ray padulong dire, kani siya na X-ray padulong dire. Okay? When very low MAS values are used and therefore few photons are striking the image receptor, one can see the uneven distribution of the exposure. So di ba, Pag less ang inyong MAS, that means lesser ang intensity sa X-rays, lesser ang number sa X-rays na mag-reach sa IR. And this will result to a quantum model. No? The radiographic image appears grainy, that is very small. Freckles or blotches of dark and light are seen across the image when closely examined. So kung tutukan mo na siya, so kung sa mga gubag mata, dili pa nila maklaro na, pero pag tutukan mo, okay, the quantum model, the blotches, the freckles in the image is very apparent. Quantum model is a mottled appearance of the image caused by the quanta or photons in the X-ray beam. So mo to siya quantum mottled, it's because of the quanta or the photons, X-ray photons striking the image receptor. Visible mottling of the image indicates that an insufficient amount of X-rays have reached the image receptor plate. Okay? Quantum mottle, like scatter radiation, is a form of image noise and is a factor in the signal to noise ratio. But the randomness of the X-ray beam distribution is not something we can have much influence over. It is an ever-present aspect of the X-ray beam. Maski unsa pa imong buhaton ana, maski unsa pa kagwapo imong image, naagid na siya mottle. But ang gwapo lang ana is pag gwapo ang imong image, less apparent ang inyong quantum mottle. Okay? And then so may buhaton ninyo para ma-decrease ang quantum mottle for digital imaging systems. Of course, we cannot increase MAS because increasing so will increase patient dose. Diba ang ginaingon sa slides, ginaingon po sa akong what do you call this? Reference na dapat dili daw MAS ang increase since again, it increases patient dose. So ang atong gina-increase ana is KVP, although there is an increase in scatter radiation, but it can still manageable man siya, makakaya man siya sa mga algorithms sa inyong computers. Paggawas niya, matanggal itong mga scatter radiation sa images. Okay? Therefore, the best way to subdue it is to overwhelm it with good exposure, such as katong increase of KVP. That is with information carrying exposure or signal. By doing this, the mottle does not go away but becomes less apparent in the image. It makes a lesser percentage contribution to the overall image. So, moto, bangbangan siya o KVP, although there is again an increase in scatter radiation, ma-edit man siya sa inyong computer. Okay, automatically ma-edit man na siya. Okay, now, what's the dining SNR or signal to noise ratio? For digital imaging systems, mga gusto siya CR and DR, nani siya appealing siya sa mga exposure factor. Okay? Pag taas ng signal to noise ratio, that means that your signal is taas and your noise is baba. So that means your signal, your image will become gwapo ang quality sa image. Pag baba ang inyong signal to noise ratio, mas taas ang inyong noise. Okay, so that means pag taas ang inyong noise, baba ang signal, so there is appearance, artifacts can occur. Okay, there will be an appearance of artifacts. Okay, so mula to siya, let's not dig deep na topic. Okay, let's go with contrast. So for contrast to exist, there must be two or more different intensities of light present. If these differences are great, then the image is regarded to have high contrast. Some contrast is required for any image to exist. So of course, in order for us to identify na kanisha is the kidneys, kanisha is the spleen, kanisha is the liver, we have to, dapat there is sufficient contrast provided to the image. Okay? If there is not enough contrast between adjacent objects in an image, one cannot tell that they are separate, distinct objects from each other. Okay? So, in order for you to identify different organs, different parts in the body, contrast should exist. So, dapat kanisha area is grayer, kanisha area is whiter. So, different intensities of colors, different intensities of light present in an image. Excessive amounts of contrast causes a loss of useful information and a loss of detail in the image. On the other hand, insufficient contrast also leads to an image in which details are not adequately visible. Okay, so pag excessive amount of contrast, that means high contrast, short scale contrast. Pag sobra kapag kaayo, loss of information. Okay, saturated na ang inyong image. Okay, there will be loss of detail, then hindi mo ma-identify kung which is which. On the other hand, Pag kulang ang imong contrast, dili na kaayo siya klaro ang detalye. Okay? So dapat ang button ninyo is nalang ta sa middle, which is the optimal contrast. If there is barely any difference between two adjacent shades of gray, it will be difficult for the human eye to detect that there are indeed two shades there. Okay, so limited lang man po ang capacity sa ato ang eyes. Therefore, you should provide a contrast that is of optimum value. When these shades of gray cannot be distinguished from each other, information is again lost. So same lang, pag excessive ang contrast, saturated ang image, dili klaro ang detalye. Pag low contrast, daghan ra kaayog shades of gray, wala nakakabalo kung asa ang asa. So detail is also destroyed. The ideal amount of contrast in any image lies in an intermediate range. Okay? Again, in the middle of high and low contrast. The word optimum is used to describe such an intermediate level which is neither too much nor too little. Na lang siya sa tunga, intermediate range. Okay? So again, excessive amounts of contrast, high contrast, short scale. Pag super short scale, we call it saturated image. Katong pareha sa itong image na kung gipakita ganina. And then, loss of detail will occur. And of course, pag too much of a low contrast, daghan na kayo og shades of gray, dili na kayo maklaro sa atong limited capacity sa eye, therefore loss of detail is also happens. Okay? A common misconception for medical imaging students is to assume that the higher the contrast, the better the image. In radiographic imaging, the goal is not to produce maximum contrast nor minimum, but optimum contrast. Optimum in the middle lang siya sa high and sa low contrast. Okay? Noise also decreases contrast. You all know that. In the fundamental production of any radiographic image, the control and minimizing of scatter radiation constitutes the first and foremost concern for the radiographer in eliminating the image. So, pag KVP mo, taas na pod kaayo, of course, there is an increased incidence of scatter radiation. Okay? Mo ang first and foremost concern sa radiographer pag maggamit siya of KVP or any other technical factors that could affect scatter radiation. Dapat minimize yun na siya as much as possible since scatter radiation produces noise and it decreases contrast. KVP, use of grid, and collimation are some of the factors that can affect image contrast. Kabalo naman mo anak. Pagtaas ng KVP, sa man na may tabo, bumaba ang contrast. Pagbaba ang KVP, yes, masaka ang contrast. Okay? Use of grid, pag magamit mo grid, image contrast is increased. And if tight ang inyong collimation, image contrast is also increased. Yeah, let's go to recorded detail. The sharpness of recorded detail at the edges of the image depends upon the width of the penumbra. Okay? Diba, na-discuss na ako ni previously that this area here sa kilid is what we call penumbra. Okay? Anything which does not change the spread of penumbra cannot be said to affect sharpness. Mo gini siya ang main na maka-affect sa inyong sharpness of the image. With all other factors constant, the smaller the focal spot, okay, the sharper is the recorded detail in the image. The focal spot is inversely proportional to image sharpness. As you can see in the image, di ba? Focal spot, pag gamay siya, lesser ang occurrence sa inyong penumbra. Pag dako inyong focal spot, which is kanang kung asa mag-strike ang x-rays, dako inyong penumbra. Okay? When this happens, sharpness of the detail is decreased. Pag small focal spots yung gamit, sharpness is increased, recorded detail is increased. A large focal spot, though capable of withstanding the heat generated by high electrical energies, does not produce the sharpness of detail that is characteristic of a small focal spot. Although, naamagod tayo, namagod advantage po ang large focal spot since pag maigo siya sa x-rays, di ba pag continuous magud maigo ang focal spot sa yung x-rays, di ba mag-pit siya, dali siya maguba. Okay? That is the advantage of large focal spot. Dako ang iyang area na maigo, so that means dito siya dali maguba compared to your small focal spot. So small lang ang area na gina-strike sa yung x-rays, strike. Okay? So pag small lang ang area, that means mas prone siya to damage. Mas dali siya maguba. Okay? The high heat dispersion of the rotating anode makes it possible to use these smaller sizes and maximizing image sharpness. Since we now utilize rotating anodes compared to this one, kani stationary man sila, dili man sila gatuyo. So that means ang area na maigo sa small focal spot is larger than before. Okay, since nagatuyok naman siya, so dili lang siya ma-confine sa isa ka area. So mo na siya ang murag i-compensate, nagibuhatan siya og rotating anode in order to lessen the heat sa namahatag sa anode and also to provide a sharp image. Okay? Focus spot is the controlling factor for sharpness of recorded detail. So, kung si KB mo siya ang controlling factor for image contrast, MAS for optical density, focal spot is the controlling factor for recorded detail. When the X-ray tube is moved farther away from the patient and image receptor, the amount of blur or penumbra produced at the edges of the image diminishes. Okay, so as you can see in the picture, the longer or the more increased ang inyong SID, the lesser is the appearance of the penumbra. Okay, pag closer ang inyong SID, your penumbra is increased. Okay. This occurs because of those beams recording the edges of the image are nearer to and more parallel to the central ray. Thus, the SID has a direct effect upon image sharpness. The longer or the increased is the SID, the sharper is the recorded detail, and vice versa. Okay? As long as the object is placed directly upon the imaging plate, the spread of penumbra is minimal. That means na nakadikit ang inyong object or patient sa IR, okay? Spread of penumbra is minimal. When an OID gap is introduced between the object and the plate, the penumbral shadow is spread out, and the blur at the edges of the object increases. The larger the OID, the less is the sharpness of the recorded detail. Okay? So the more ninyo na ipalayo ang object or ang pasyente from the IR, that means that your penumbra will also increase. So dapat your object or the patient is closest as much as possible to the IR. Okay, so that penumbra is minimized, therefore producing a sharper image. Now let's go to artifacts. Okay, same sa inyong film screen na subject. Artifacts are any extraneous images that obscure the desired information and come from a variety of causes too numerous to list. Regardless of their origin or cause, all artifacts obscure the visibility of useful image details and are destructive to the image and are classified as forms of noise. Maski yung sa panang na siya na artifact, maski yung sa pa siya kagwapo, it is destructive to the image. It does not contribute any information to the image. Samok-samok lang yun siya. Okay? Artifacts in the image can also be created by the imaging process itself. Scatter radiation is one example. So pag expose niyo sa pasyente, inevitable naman yun na ma-produce ang nawala yung scatter radiation na ma-produce. So during the imaging process, na-adjust na scatter radiation. Depends na lang kung increased or minimized. But others include false images which are created by the tomographic movement of the X-ray tube. That means nalihok ang yung X-ray tube while exposing the patient. Kung dili man na X-ray tube ang nalihok, it's because of patient motion or other geometrical anomalies such as distortion, specifically magnification, foreshortening, and elongation, and static electricity discharges. Nagya po siya dito. Sila kung mas pronounced ganyan diri ang static kaysa sa film screen na system. And static electricity discharges within the imaging plane, computerized processing equipment, or display system. So pag-process sa reader, there are some discrepancies, so artifacts can occur. In direct capture systems, the detector elements constituting the individual pixels can suffer from various electronic faults, which are not found in the reading process for computed radiography. These flaws introduce noise into the image or cause loss of pixel. Additional software is configured to compensate these electronic problems. Therefore, DR systems typically undergo more pre-display processes than those required in CR. So for example, ang pixels ninyo kay nag-fail to function siya, nag-fail ang function sa yung pixels. Okay? So this can be avoided. The artifacts that are caused by these electronic faults sa inyong pixels, nangamatay yung pixels na ay short circuit or unsa ba, it can be easily compensated by your pre-display processes or kanang pag-process sa image, pag-edit sa image before siya mag-appear sa inyong monitor. For CR, the most common source of artifacts is the image receptor plate. So katong IP, imaging plate. These artifacts are usually temporary white spots. Yes, from dust or dirt on the plate. So di ba, as I have said also sa artifacts from film screen system, pag hugaw yun na ang inyong image receptor, specifically the screens, it will produce white spots. Okay? Or ghosting, which refers to residual images that were not fully erased from a previous exposure. So ghosting occurs when wala na tarong o limpyo, erase ang inyong imaging plate, or wala dyan na erase ang inyong imaging plate. Okay? The accumulation of permanent scratches on the plate, the non-uniform performance from aging phosphors, so the accumulation of permanent scratches on the plate, so nakambrasan, okay? Na-scratch ang inyong plate, a non-uniform performance, that means it's because of your aging phosphor, dugay na kayo ginagamit yung phosphor, na ay times na gapang image, na ay times na taas ang density, na ay taas na, ay na ay sometimes na taas ang contrast, no, dili siya uniform ang pag-produce sa images sa inyong imaging plate, or a substantial malfunction of pixels. There are times magod na ang pixels ninyo, dili na siya mag-function normally. So there will be times na mag-cause of artifacts. Will require replacement of the image receptor. So, pag na-scratch ang inyong IP, pag aged na ang inyong phosphor, and pag mag-malfunction ang inyong pixels, most likely ang remedy ana is to replace the image receptor. Okay? So here are some of the image receptor artifacts found in CR and DR systems. The appearance of ghost images occurs because of incomplete erasure of a previous image on a CR IP. So kani siya, as you can see, di ba na ay murag boundary, na ay boundary. Okay, so there are murag other na image na na-produce. So actually, ang most recent na exposure ani is the chest. Ang previous ani is nabaliktad na pelvis. Okay, so this is the ilium, basta nakabali ang inyong pelvis ana. Okay? Usually, such artifacts can be corrected by additional signal exposure techniques. So this can be corrected by pre-processing gihapon. Okay? So before siya i-display sa monitor, pwede siya i-edit ba sa computer, and kani siya mara po siya electronic version sa inyong double exposure. Okay? If a CR IP has not been used for 24 hours, it should be erased again before use. Diba? Dapat yan 48 hours, pero as much as possible, 24 hours yun, i-erase na siya daan. Okay? Because, again, ghosting can occur. Rough handling or faulty construction of a digital imaging plate can result in artifacts. Note the white shapes on the left side, ayan po, which resulted when the computed radiography imaging plate came apart. So nabungkag siya. Okay, nasira siya. Okay, nagukang ang inyong imaging plate. Therefore, introducing this type of artifacts. Okay? It's caused by rough handling or faulty construction. So when that happens, masama yung button ana. If it can be repaired, sige, darga. But if it's beyond repair, replace. Okay? Artifacts which appear consistently on most or all images are likely the result of hardware or software problems in the CR reader rather than the imaging plate. So kanang mga magbalik-balik na artifacts, maski naka-10 na ka na exposure o exposure and parid sa CR, balik-balik lang yapon ang artifacts, that means that it is most likely ang iyang cause ana is naa sa hardware, okay, or software, not sa inyong imaging plate. Okay, most likely. Line or column dropout can result from malfunction of the reader transport and scanning systems. Plates can become jammed in the reader, leading to artifacts. Okay? So may naong anang line or column dropout. Again. So line or column dropout. That means that your pixels, no, wala nag-malfunction siya. Okay? So dapat good ang image ani is kani siya diri na area white, kani black, kani diri kini mga grayish na color. Okay? So because nag-malfunction yung pixels na kanina linyahan, okay, yan yung ihang gawas. Okay? Dust particles sticking to the oscillating flat mirror, the rotating polygonal mirror, or the light guides in the reader can cause pixel dropout. So, dapat limpyuhan ninyo. Okay? Kung dili man siya malimpyuhan, professional help should be acquired. Over time, the laser itself will need replacing due to loss of power. So, dili man siya all the time na okay ang yung laser. There will be time na ma-replace siya, most especially kung dugay na siya nagamit. Artifacts produced by dust can be corrected easily with proper cleaning unless the dust is internal to the optics of a CR system. Yun, professional help is advised. So, malimpyuhan siya kung sa outer areas. Pero kung nana siya sa mga inner areas sa inyong scanner, okay, professional help should be acquired again. Okay, so muna siya. It can be caused by dust on the optic polygonal mirror, optic mirror, or sa fiber optics. Okay, dust on the optics, lenses, and mirrors of a CR processor can cause pixel dropout. Okay, pixel dropout or column dropout or line dropout, bayaran na sila. Such as this one, in which an entire line of pixel is deleted. Interpolation can also be used to remove this artifact. So, in order to remedy this one, pwede siya computer algorithm na what we call introduce out interpolation. Okay? Interpolation is a process of assigning a value to a dead pixel based on the recorded values of adjacent pixels. So, pag applyan nato ni siya og interpolation, mag-base ang computer sa mga pixels na nasa ihang kilid. So, kung ako computer, yan siya, black din sa kilid. So, dapat black po ko dito. Kani white sa kilid, so mag-white po ko dito. So, siya na ang mag-fill out depending sa mga pixels na nasa ihang surrounding region. Okay, so muna ginabuhat for interpolation. Okay? So routine quality control should include regular documentation of imaging frequency, imaging performance, and the physical condition of each IP to reduce artifact appearance and help prevent failure. So, yan siya. So kung dili siya makayog interpolation, dapat yun document mo. So, after 10 images, lahi na po ng image. Ang 11th image. So, ang physical condition sa iyong imaging plate, nangalangkat na ang screw. So, that means, basin, maguba na siya. So, dapat quality control and documentation. It's important. Okay? For software artifacts, ayan. Okay, here's one example. Okay, so irradiation of a digital radiographic imaging receptor by the raw X-ray beam may show variations over the image, producing an irregular pattern that could interfere with diagnosis. Okay, so pag ana ang gawas, ang cause, so pag raw X-ray beam, diretso siya sa imaging receptor or image receptor, ang gawas. Okay, sometimes, okay, can interfere with image diagnosis. With this irregular pattern, a pre-processing manipulation known as flat fielding, spelling sa flat fielding is F-L-A-T, F-I-E-L-D-I-N-G, flat fielding, one word, is performed, resulting in a uniform response to a uniform X-ray beam. So, kaya siya, ang nag-cause magud ani is anode Hill effect. Diba? As you can remember, the intensity of the X-ray is more intense on the cathode side kaysa sa anode side. Pag yung ani ang mag-occur, okay, we can introduce a processor algorithm or manipulation such as the flat fielding. So when flat fielding is applied, medyo uniform na siya compared ani. Okay, although nagya po yung mga model diri, much better na siya kaysa sa kanina image. Okay, it's called flat fielding. Okay. Failure in segmentation or histogram analysis can be caused by accumulated background and scatter radiation on CR plates that have not been erased over a long period of time. Proper collimation is essential, and the use of lead strips It's recommended to shield one side of the cassette when multiple exposures will be taken on the same plate. Okay, so what do you mean by segmentation? Sige, sa next slide na lang to siya. Okay, so pag ma-accumulate ganyan background radiation, asa man siya na part sa histogram, it is on the tail area sa inyong histogram. And kung si-scatter siya, nasa sa before S1 na area. Okay? So dapat, when that happens, what sa yung buhaton? Okay? So, in order to prevent this from happening di ay, okay? So, limpyuhan ang imaging plate by erasing. Okay? Katong mga wala na gamit, i-erase siya before siya gamiton for 24 to 48 hours. Okay? So, itong mga 24 to 48 hours na wala na gamit, i-erase. Proper collimation is also essential para mag-minimize ang inyong scatter radiation. And if you are going to use two views sa isa ka imaging plate, diba, as I have mentioned sa midterm na dapat diliingan ang practice, diba, kay katong naay area in the middle of the views na mag-cause og artifact. So, ma-apply to siya direct. Okay? So, ang buhatan ninyo is, buhat yan og lead strips sa itong first ninyo na exposure so that dili ma-apektuhan ang inyong first exposure. Because ma-absorb man sa lead strips ang inyong scatter radiation. Therefore, minimize ang production of scatter radiation on the first image when exposing the second image on the same plate. Okay? Software artifacts can result from selecting the wrong processing algorithm, gamit ba, wala ka kabalo kung kanino ka magamit og interpolation or flat fielding, poor positioning, wala na center ang pasyente, the presence of metal prosthetic devices in the body such as braces, mga titanium na mga bakal, and other unusual anatomical variations or segmentation failure in high scatter situations. So muna siya ang mga software artifacts causes. Okay? Edge enhancement algorithms can produce substantial halo artifacts. These appear as dark bands at the interfaces of adjacent high contrast structures such as metal prostheses or a solid column bolus of barium. Okay? So ganito siya. When we use edge enhancement na algorithm sa atong image, kaya siya, as you can see, di ba, na ay halo, na ay itong-itong. Okay? So this is produced pag nagamit ang edge enhancement sa metallic na mga objects and those that produce high image contrast. Okay? Produce white na color. So as you can see, na ay itong-itong dito sa surrounding areas. Okay, that's what happens when you use edge enhancement on these type of objects. Okay, but this image is sa CT scan niya ha. Okay. So many CR systems use partitioned PARTITIONED pattern recognition software to scan across the plate and determine the number and orientation of views on one plate. A process also called as segmentation. So, dali na itong sulutong sa segmentation. Okay? Pag mag-expose ka of two views in one imaging plate, there is this algorithm or software sa inyong computer that can identify the number of orientation or the number of views in one single plate. And that is what we call segmentation ng tawag ana or katong partition pattern recognition software. So, it recognizes na ayaw kanina imaging plate na ay duha ka views. Okay? Kanina kay tulo ka views. Okay? So to assist the computer in making the distinction between bone images and blank spaces between fields, the body part must be centered well within each exposure field and all collimation must be parallel to and equidistant from the edges of the imaging plate. So if you are going to imagine this one, it is, medyo kuti siya. Okay? Medyo, lisod siya buhaton. So, ang buhaton ninyo ana is, di na lang mo ma'am, two views. Isa-isa na lang gina ninyo per imaging plate. Okay? So, medyo puti man siya. So, ngita mo pumaagi of which you are going to use one image per plate na lang yun. Okay? Ayan. Kani siya ang mahitabo pag nag-fail ang inyong segmentation. So, this is the one view per plate. Two views, natarong ang segmentation per plate. Kani siya wala siya natarong because as you can see the image is underexposed. So wala natarong og identify ni computer na ay duha din ni ka images. Okay, so ang pagbasa niya is one image because as you can see, dili equidistant ang ilahang gaps. Okay? Hiwi pagid ni siya, tapos dili tarong ang collimation per view. Okay, dili sila the same. So mo akong ingon, medyo puti siya. So that is why ang buhaton na lang nato is one view per plate na lang natong gamiton. Okay? Artifacts involving missing lines or pixels can indicate memory problems, digitization problems, or communication errors between computers and imaging components. Okay, example of pixel dropout for entire rows of pixels. Itong nasa sunod, wait lang. Software can compensate for moderate cases by interpolating and filling these pixels. So as I have said a while ago, na pag na ay missing lines or nangamatay yung pixels, nag-malfunction yung pixels, interpolation can be the solution to your problem. Okay? Pero ang cause ana is most likely nasa memory, digitization, and communication errors between the computer and imaging components. So between the imaging plate and the computer and the reader. Yan. Yan ihang gawas. Okay? So pixel dropout na siya. So ang solution ani niya is again interpolation para ma-fill in ni siyang mga gaps dito. Okay? Yan. Aliasing patterns emerge in the image when the sampling rate or the Nyquist frequency in line pairs per millimeter approximates the line resolution of the imaging plate, such that the two overlap at certain frequencies. Okay? Na-discuss naman ito previously na si aliasing patterns is the electronic version of the Moore na artifact. Okay, so it happens kung sa film screen pa siya, nag-overlap ang duha ka grid with the same sampling frequency. Pero kung dire, sa inyong CR, nag-overlap both ang inyong CR reader and ang inyong imaging plate sa ilang frequencies. It also creates a problem when the line resolution is a multiple of the sampling frequency. For example, if the plate resolution is 8 line pairs per millimeter, and the sampling frequency is 4 line pairs per millimeter, inadequate pixel sampling will occur as every other line is missed. Okay? So kung sa imaging plate, 8 line pairs per millimeter, tapos ang sampling frequency which is na sa reader is 4 line pairs per millimeter, di ba marag ano siya? Divisible siya na number, 4 and 8. Okay? So when that happens, aliasing patterns can emerge. With CR imaging, the Moore artifact is actually much more likely to occur. This electronic version is called an aliasing artifact. So, nainuna ko na siya. This occurs most commonly when using both stationary and SD grids sa film screen. When the Moore artifact is recurring problem with a CR reader, either new grids must be purchased with a different frequency, grid lines per inch, or the scanning frequency of the CR reader would have to be changed. Ganyan. Okay? So since we are using different accessories such as grid sa CR pod, okay, tapos napod dito yung reader na napod sila iyahang line pairs per millimeter or iyahang Nyquist frequency or sampling frequency, napod yung sampling frequency ang inyong imaging plate. So pag nagtapal-tapal ni sila, kaning tulo, it is more likely na mag-occur ang inyong aliasing artifact. Okay, so to solve this, special multi-hole grids are available which can also solve this problem. Okay? So mo to siya, di ba? Na-discuss na to previously that aliasing artifact occurs pag nagtapal-tapal or nagsapaw-sapaw ang inyong Nyquist frequency from the sampling frequency and the frequency of the grid. Okay? Image. Yan. So as you can see naman, di ba? It runs vertically. Mga linya-linya. Okay? So that means nagsapaw-sapaw na ang mga sampling frequency and the Nyquist frequency of the imaging plate and the CR. And also, it can be because of the frequency of the grid strips sa inyong grid. Aliasing or Moore artifacts can also be caused by on-display screen. So, kung wala ang problema sa inyo, kung okay man ang frequency sa inyong grid, sa inyong CR reader, and sa imaging plate, maybe the problem is not with them, but because of the monitor or the display screen. Okay? So electronic motor can also be caused by fluctuations of electrical current passing through the imaging system. So, na-discuss na ito ganina, electronic model. Ayan. Okay? Electronic model, since digital image man ang atua, so your electronic model can be maglihok-lihok na siya. Okay? So for the object artifacts, yeah. Object artifacts can arise from the technology's error in patient positioning, X-ray beam collimation, and histogram selection. Diba? In histogram selection, you have to apply the specific lookup table para sa imong image na gamiton. For example, kumari si patient na ay prosthesis, diba? Natay murag tulo ka lookup table na gamiton. It's either type 1, type 2, or type 3. So dapat mag-match to sila. Okay? As previously discussed. Backscatter radiation also can be troublesome because of the sensitivity of the digital radiographic image receptor. So, what is backscatter radiation? If a lot of scattering material is present behind the image receptor, okay, for example, na ay positioning dial sa likod sa image receptor. Okay, so we all know that the main scattering object or the main scattering subject is the patient man. So when that happens, if the radiographic positioning dial has the same tissue density as the normal human person, they can also produce a scatter radiation. Okay, backscatter radiation can cause a phantom image. So pag na-expose ang imaging plate with the radiographic positioning dial behind and mag-produce of scattered X-ray si positioning dial, tapos mobalik siya sa image receptor, that means scatter back ang radiation padulong sa inyong image receptor. So, ang scatter radiation, mobalik siya to the image receptor. That's why it's called backscatter radiation. If this type of artifact is discovered, the backside of the image receptor should be shielded to reduce backscatter X-rays. So in the production of imaging plates and also kanang image receptor or the cassette, is dapat ang likod jud ana niya is increase ang atomic number so that it can shield the backside of the cassette from backscatter radiation, thereby not affecting the film inside or the imaging plate inside the cassette. Okay? All artifacts caused by equipment will fall on this category. Of course, equipment artifacts yan. Okay? So hard copy laser printers have many of the same issues that old-fashioned radiographic chemical processors suffered from. Artifacts which can show up on the hard copy film include fog, pressure marks, and static electricity marks. Okay? So same lang sa previous sa mga automatic processor, it can produce fog sa image, pressure marks such as ink marks, and of course static electricity marks. Okay, pag too much na ang humidity sa area, pag baba na kayo ang humidity sa area. If the film conveyor system malfunctions, image distortion, abnormal shading, or uneven scan line distribution can result. Okay, so image distortion, di ba, ma-distort ang image, mudako ang, for example, ang mga long bones, ma-shorten, ang mga skull, ma-shorten. Okay, abnormal shading, that means ma-increase ang iyang contrast or ma-decrease ang iyang contrast. And for scan line distribution, ako yung image na ipakita for the next slide. Okay? Artifacts can result from placing the single side emulsion of the film upside down in the printer. So, di ba, ginagamit mo na ito pag print karon sa mga film, kumari, di ba, digital image man siya. So, if the patient asks for a hard copy of the image, of course, ang gamiton ninyo is film. Okay? Kaya kung papel lang na siya, pangit kaayo ang gawas. Okay? So, when that happens, much better kung double-sided or double emulsion na film ang inyong gamiton. So that, dili siya, mas yung sa inyong bali-bali, dili siya makaproduce of artifacts. Unlike single-sided emulsion films na pag ma-upside down mo siya butang sa printer, it will produce artifacts. Okay? So, for an example of the uneven scan line distribution, ayan. So, as you can see in the picture, di ba na siya yung mga line dala. This is just an example na ma-produce sa inyong printer. Okay, uneven scan line distribution. And that concludes the async video. Okay, thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, most especially in exposure indicator, I don't expect you to grasp the topic agad-agad, no? So, wala tayong mabuhat, ana. We have to review na lang yun. Okay? So, if you have any questions, gani, please message me. I'll be willing, much welcome to assist you in your queries. Okay? And we'll be having a quiz about this one next week. Okay? So, that will be all. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.